Chris will take us forward.
Thanks, Sean. I've been asked to introduce this session and also to moderate the discussion. I'm in the very fortunate position that I'm going to introduce to you three speakers who probably need no introduction. But we have three papers that will set the context for much of the discussion that will go on throughout the rest of today and over the following days. We're going to begin with Professor Dzul, who I think is well known to everybody, and he will set context by thinking about some of the issues in leadership. Professor C.K. Rashi will follow, talking about the broad agenda in the decolonisation of Africa. And then our final paper will switch the focus away from Asia to Africa. And Professor Babouazibwa Dutu will talk about issues in cultural bitterness and leadership challenges in Africa. Each of our presenters has around about 20-25 minutes, and that will leave us a little bit of time for questions and discussions at the end. So can I begin by inviting Professor Dzul to come up and to deliver his talk on leadership in global higher education, an Asian dream or nightmare.
Thank you, Chris. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, greeting of peace and good afternoon. I'm going to just take maybe about 15 minutes or so to run through a paper which I've given to the organizers, about 20 odd pages. And it's entitled Leadership in Global Higher Education, an Asian Dream or a Nightmare. This paper is written in the context of, we are looking at a possible ASEAN economic community coming about at the end of the year, 2015, encompassing maybe 10 ASEAN countries representing 600 million population with a GDP of about 2.5 trillion around that. And therefore higher education, I guess, is an important area for us to focus on. And as it stands, higher education in these 10 countries has not been quote-unquote harmonized. There's very little in terms of linking up and relationships building in these countries. And therefore, the question that is asked now, how do we actually harmonize? How do we come about bringing a higher education system that can actually relate to the 10 countries, if not more than that? Yeah? I also will try to bring this idea of the first conference that we had in 2011, some of the ideas that probably is relevant in trying to build this higher education community in ASEAN, and how we can use this as a platform to make sure that the higher education community in ASEAN can be developed in that sense. If I were to begin with this idea of decolonization in the conference of 2011, we are quite set to actually rediscover some of the knowledge base that is in existence in many of these countries, and try to connect them back to our own cultural context, our own civilization as it were, and also the heritage as far as knowledge and wisdom is concerned. We are also trying to connect again with the other dimensions of higher education within the broad base of ASEAN and also Asia in that particular context, bringing the wealth of civilization in China, in India, and other parts of Asia. So that will be the kind of premise that I will look at, and to hopefully by then remove some of the stereotypes that we have got on higher education as it stands. Now, one of the challenges that we see is basically to look at what are the processes that's happening worldwide. And one of the very dominant and I think a very substantial, impactful change that has happened is basically in Europe through what we call the Bologna process. The Bologna process started in 1999, it's about 15 years now. A group of countries that comes together and try to kind of harmonize and find a relationship between higher education with this country, now has grown to more than 47 countries across Europe and in fact outside Europe at the same time. What is good about the Bologna process as far as I can see is it is a voluntary process that comes from bottom up rather than the usual Asian way or at least a Malaysian way of trying to impose from top down. Yeah? So it is a voluntary discussion where they actually come up to a kind of agreement of what to do, but then leave it to various community and various universities to pick what is relevant to them and try to implement them. In that sense, I think it is a very good process. But we have got some problems with this Bologna process in the sense that if you look at the decolonized perspective, there are some things that I think we need to pay attention to. Particularly the Bologna process is trying to create, and I quote from some of the documents, a European higher education area. In other words, it brings very clearly a kind of a European dimension, and that is done in the context of to match the performance of the best performing systems in the world, notably United States and Asia. So there is again this element of building this particular system more in the context of competition with another area, United States and also Asia. In Asia, I put a question mark because I'm not too sure whether Asia is really in that kind of a competition. And it also says here that the main strategy, therefore, is to have a European heritage, European tradition, and European value as a kind of a base as far as the Bologna process is concerned. So that is something that we need to be mindful of, because we would like to join some Asian countries that sign up and join the Bologna process in the hope that it will, be part of a larger community, but we are saddled with some of this issue that I've brought in. And more importantly, I think the Bologna process is also aware of this particular issue and then try to open up as much membership as possible, including a number of Central Asian countries and also Asian countries. So you need to be very aware that you're signing on something which may not work within your own systems or your own cultural context. More importantly, I think this whole question of definition of what university is all about. In many of our traditions, there are already universities. Although they are not called universities, they are called madrasah, they are called by various other names, but by and large, they are supposed to be a place of dissemination, generation of knowledge, which is what we understand university is all about. And therefore, the question of what sort of paradigm do we adopt at the end of the day will be another issue for us to understand. Now, in that context, I think this word university is something that I would want to put a question mark on, because it is a paradigm that actually has its own definition. And the definition, according to the Magna Carta Unitatum, which is created within the Bologna process, in one of the principles it says that it endorses the universality of European university as a trustee of the European humanist tradition. We've just heard from Ahmed that this tradition is one of the main traditions in this free world of the West, as it were. And therefore, becoming the trustee of the European humanist tradition has a different implication, has a different meaning to the understanding or the idea of what university is all about. And therefore, we may want to find out whether there is something that we can live with as far as university is concerned. Why I brought this up? Because there is already an indication that many Asian universities want to follow this kind of a model. China, for example, has already announced that they want to create 100 world-class universities. And this world-class university falls in this definition of what a Eurocentric university looks like. And therefore, the question of whether we want to follow that kind of idea of trying to rank our university as a world-class university, again, is something that we need to discuss. And in Malaysia, I think this league table, this ranking, is something that always elicits a lot of emotion, a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy, particularly if you don't fall within this realm of so-called world-class labor, as it were. And therefore the issue would be, are we subscribing to one world, is to follow the narrative of Ahmad, or do we subscribe to different worlds? In other words, when people ask me, are you a world-class university? My immediate response is, whose world are we talking about? Because my world and your world may not be the same. And subscribing to a world-class university without that kind of a clarification will probably land up in a different sort of league table, as it were. And this is something which is very clear in the meeting of 2011, when we came up with a statement that talks about another world is desirable. In other words, we are not content with just one definition or a one-size-fits-all university, but we want to look at a different model. And I would like just to read to you some of the relevant parts of what this statement is. Let me start off with, and it says here, too many of our universities, which is the non-Western universities, have been a pale imitation of the Western universities, with marginal creative contribution of their own, and with little or no organic relation with their local communities and environment. Learning environments has been hostile, meaningless, and irrelevant to our life and concern. And indeed, if this is true, then I think something ought to be done in trying to create these other possibilities as far as universities is concerned. Now, I will go on in this particular paper to cite why do we need to be very careful on what university we choose to follow and to actually commit ourselves to. We go back to the whole history, and I think Ahmad has given some of these narratives of the Renaissance, of the Enlightenment, and whatever is the outcome of that kind of a philosophy, or perhaps the kind of epistemology that is related to it. So I will not go through that, because that I think has been well dealt with. The Penang discussion, therefore, brings us to the idea of trying to restore some of the organic connections between local communities and universities and culture, which I've mentioned, to rediscover some of the indigenous intellectual traditions and resources, and also to nurture not just good workers, but also good citizens. And this is where I have a very strong objection with the word that has been used now on the context of human capital. If you look many documents around the world, Malaysia is no exception, that the word human capital has been used in a very casual fashion, not realizing that the word human capital has got a loaded sort of meaning based on cultural and also ideological basis. And moreover for Malaysia, when you look at the national philosophy of education, there's not a single word about human capital where you talk about a balanced human being. People who are actually balanced in that particular context, again, very much what was said this morning. And this word balanced human being is no longer an important word in this document of education, except when Professor Asma mentioned that the new blueprint of higher education will insert back this word balance. And therefore, I think there is a kind of a dichotomy that we need to be aware of as far as building this ASEAN or Asian network, as it were. And last but not least, I think there is also then a need for Asia, therefore, to reconceptualize and to come up with an alternative model, of which I have now put three questions as far as leadership in higher education in Asia is concerned. First, I'll content that Asia pushes forward into the future. The question is how much of the current global construct can be reconfigured to make it more just and fair. And the idea is basically, if you look at higher education worldwide, there's an increasing disparity between people who can pay for education and people who cannot pay for education. The number of people who are not accessible to higher education now is increasing over time. If they are accessible to higher education, the number that is successfully graduating for higher education, again, is lowering. And if they even get successfully graduating for higher education, the relevance of education, the relevance of knowledge is again something that we need to talk about. Okay? In the previous centuries, many global agenda pursued by industrialized countries of the global north subtly put their interests ahead of the rest, including Asia, and perpetuating an uneven playing field. And the question that I ask, can Asia, if you want to lead in higher education, provide a more equitable leadership based on its traditional understanding of education as a leveler of society? Second question that I put forward is whether Asia can harmonize some of the differences that have been created through colonial processes. I mean, we have now got in Asia this division of Middle East, Far East, and also South Asia and the rest of it. That itself, I think, is a kind of an artificial division that gives Asia a different outlook and a different kind of a construct within Asia. If you look at Europe, there's no such thing. If you look at the West, there's no such thing as Far West, Middle West, and they are basically quite homogeneous in that particular sense. So this division within the Asia, whether it's real or otherwise, how can we actually now realign it and have one notion of what Asia is all about, and then trying to develop leadership in terms of higher education in that particular context? Because, like I mentioned, there are already enough evidence of, the tradition of higher education within this particular region. So, can Asia leverage on its rich, long historical, cultural, and inter-civilizational experiences, which is generally dubbed as the Western Dark Ages, further celebrate diversity of knowledge, yet remaining being inclusive by creating a collaborative common education platform for a truly globalized world? And lastly, given the diversity of culture and civilization and religious belief, can ethics generally be made more collective by redefining the current dominant global ethics that dominates since the day of the Renaissance of the West? This is in recognition of the fact that today's the question or what we call global ethics are failing as an indication of the various global crises extending from ecology, economics, geopolitics, and not least education. And education in this particular context, some people will call it education without soul. Can we then harmonize the long tradition and wisdom that we've got in Asia to create a more ethical sort of system within education in Asia? Simply put, can Asia, unlike its counterpart, move away from a provincial thinking of a limited Asian dream? This again in contrast, there's an American dream, there's also an European dream, but Asia, people are beginning to talk about Asian century, Asian dreams. But can we move away from that, rather talking about a larger dimension to build a truly inclusive global dream worthy of higher education in the future, so that we can have really a knowledge without borders, as is now being trying to practice in the Nottingham University, using the actual ethos of education intact for developing the future of mankind as well. And last but not least, I quoted some work that is written by, let me see if I can get the name right. Hedges, his book on the illusion of wisdom, that he talks about basically a culture that does not grasp the vital interplay between morality and power, which mistakes management techniques for wisdom, which fails to understand the measure of civilization and its compassion, not its speech and ability to consume, condemns itself to death. Indeed, the time has come, I think, to reclaim the ethos of education that upholds human being as a valued member of humanity, rooted in virtues that nourishes human dignity globally. And I guess this is one of the very fundamental issues, not only Asia must grapple, but all of us must grapple. When Asia particularly, representing 60% of the world population, must therefore lead the way to reconstruct education for the future. On that note, I thank you.